Hello, I'm Katie. This is my psych project, and today I'm going to be talking about the juvenile justice system. So, let's start with a little bit of an introduction. The juvenile justice system belongs in the complicated intersection between legal accountability and developmental psychology. Understanding how psychology affects juvenile justice helps to allow for more effective legal responses to young crime. Now let's talk about the history of the juvenile system. So in 1899, the U.S. established its first juvenile court in Cook County, Illinois. Before this, youth who committed crimes were typically confined in regular adult jails. It didn't really matter the degree of their crime or their age and even their gender. They were unjustly incarcerated alongside adult criminals and the mentally ill in prison, making them extremely vulnerable. After the first court was built came the rapid spread of juvenile courts across the country, with the main goal being rehabilitation for young offenders by making courts more informal and individualized. In sentencing, the courts used the parens patriae doctrine, which came all the way from England, rooted in the idea that the state is essentially a parent to children that cannot care for themselves, and in doing so, they must protect the children's best interest. And then in the 1990s, we saw a significant change in the US as the tough on crime trend allowed the creation of harsher laws for juvenile crime, which eventually led to a rapid decrease in youth crime rates. And this is where the US unfortunately shifts away from rehabilitation and more towards incarceration. The first important landmark case we will be discussing is in Rigault of 1967. In this case, Gerald Galt, a 15-year-old, was arrested for making inappropriate phone calls to his neighbor. Many things went wrong in this case. First, Gerald's parents weren't informed of their son's arrest. His parents weren't present for his hearing, and he was also unjustly sentenced to juvenile detention for 6 years, whereas the adult sentence for the same crime that he committed would have been a maximum sentence of 50 years and 2 months in jail. Eventually, this case was brought to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they held that juveniles are entitled to the same procedural safeguards as adults under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. And then in 2005, we had Roper v. Simmons, where 17-year-old Christopher Simmons was convicted for first-degree murder and sentenced to death once he turned 18 years old, which was a common tactic for the government to go around death penalties for juveniles. In a previous case, Atkins v. Virginia, the court decided that the execution of intellectually disabled individuals is considered cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. Simmons used this precedent to try to argue that executing juveniles after they become adults is also a violation of the Eighth Amendment. The Missouri Supreme Court agreed, and the death penalty has since been abolished for children due to developmental psychological research. So, why is this even important? Why are we learning about research? Now, let me introduce you to Naomi Goldstein, Director of the Juvenile Justice Research and Reform Lab at Drexel University. She asked this important question: how can we restructure the system based on what we know about adolescent development to promote positive behaviors rather than fighting against kids' natural instincts? And I think this question really clearly states the importance of psychological research in the legal system. Backed by studies and research, psychologists are able to use their knowledge to advocate for policy changes that try to help children using their own strengths rather than trying to punish them based on their own weaknesses. A young brain's development is so fragile and complex that only through research can we understand the inner workings of it. So, what did we find? There are two pivotal studies in developmental science that I will be diving into today. The first is the pathway to desistance, which was done from 2000 to 2010 by Edward Mulvey and other co-investigators. This study explores the different factors that cause convicted juveniles to stop committing crimes. It was conducted by following 1,354 serious juvenile offenders, varying in age from 15 to 17 for 7 years after their adjudication. These individuals were examined to determine what factors led to their desistance or recidivism. Here are some key findings. First, Mulvey found that criminal behavior naturally decreases over time, especially with the proper support system in place. This means that excessively long sentences are potentially more damaging for the individual's growth because they have the ability to naturally decline their urge to commit crimes, but instead are locked up, not even given the opportunity to change. Next is the positive effect of rehabilitation. This study proves that youth respond more positively to rehabilitation than to punishment. Rehabilitative programs that emphasize education, community support, and psychological treatment were shown to be way more effective in promoting desistance among youth than those who solely faced incarceration. And thirdly, it was found that institutional placement has little benefits for reducing recidivism. In fact, longer institutional stays in places like juvenile detentions actually showed absolutely no benefit for reducing recidivism. This really goes to show how important the quality of the program is during the confinement rather than just the quantity of time spent confined. And a more recent study published in 2021 is the Northwestern Juvenile Project, which analyzed 1,828 incarcerated youth from the ages of 10 to 18 by interviewing and re interviewing them over the period of 16 years, which allowed researchers to keep track of changes in their mental health and among other things. They were able to draw a strong correlation between exposure to violence and participation in crimes for juveniles. 32% of the males that they were following in this study had been injured or killed by a firearm prior to age 32. In another study called the Crossroads Study by Schulman, it was found that around 64% of participants that were incarcerated juveniles were direct victims of a serious violent event when they were 14 to 17. Trauma and violence are two incredibly difficult hurdles to work through. Individuals have a variety of different mental health and behavioral needs that must be taken into account when policy making and sentencing. What we have learned through decades of research, including the Pathways to Desistance study and the Northwest Juvenile Project, is that punishment alone is not the answer. Young people are not simply miniature adults, but they are individuals that are still in the long process of growing, healing, and changing. By using psychology to understand that support and rehabilitation are far more effective, we can get closer to building a justice system that is not only fair, but transformational. We as a society must recognize that adolescence is not a fixed state of failure, but a beautiful window of opportunity. Science has shown us the facts, and now law must follow. Thank you for watching my presentation. That is all. I hope you enjoyed, and please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.